SI joints are two joints that connect between the sacrum and the hip bones, namely the ilium part of the hip bones, hence why they're called the sacroiliac joints. There's two of them. We often hear about sacroiliac joint, but it's actually two of them, one on either side, and their role is to act as a bridge of weight transfer from the upper body through to the lower body. So if you're taking a step forward, if you're running, if you're going from sitting to standing or in standing, there's load and forces that are going through your body down and up, and those sacroiliac joints act as a bridge for that load to go from your upper body through to your lower body and then back up again from your lower body through to your upper body. They hold a infamous role within yoga, namely because they're such a hot spot, both figuratively and literally. One of the primary reasons for this, and there's three in my mind, but one of them is because in yoga there tends to be a lot of focus on verbiage about hip opening, yet our cueing doesn't actually focus specifically on hip opening. As a friend of mine was telling me, he was coming out of the studio after practicing yoga for about a year and asked me, why is it that my hips are still just as tight as they were a year ago? And my answer was, well, because they're not actually focusing on your hips. So while we talk a lot about hip opening, when you actually look at and listen to how we are cueing as a general industry, the focus is not on improving hip mobility and hip stability, something I'll get to in just a moment. There's two other things that I find are big factors in why SI joint issues are quite prevalent within our practice. One other reason is because of tucking of the tailbone, and the other is a strong focus on keeping the ribs down and in. Those three things combined create a whole host of compensatory problems and patterns, which for a lot of people can land square and central into the SI joints. And when those folks who have their weak factor in their SI joints start to improve what's going on at the ribs and improve what's going on at the hips and stop doing the tucking of the tailbone, really cool stuff happens in how they transfer load, how they transfer force through their body, and their SIs stop being a problem. Interesting, isn't it? So let's take a deeper look at this. When we look at the practice of yoga, there are about 4 yoga poses that are perhaps the most injurious to, specifically to the SI joints, although I'll say that a lot of how we cue in yoga leads to these particular poses being most injurious. I don't think they hold the captain's hat with this award. I think there's a lot that's going on within the practice that leads to these particular poses being the vanguard, so to speak, of creating SI joint problems. And those are triangle, extended side angle, warrior 2, and in some cases warrior 1. And the primary reason for these 4 as being key is because of what's not happening between the leg bone and the pelvis. And let me demonstrate. When we look at the leg bone or the femur movement in the pelvis, there are 6 ranges of motion. There's external and internal rotation. There's flexion, and then there's extension, and then there's abduction and adduction. That's 6 ranges. When we look at the SI, there's only 2. So we've got a lot of availability here and very little through here. We can also look at the spine and the knee, which are neighboring joint areas, and we can take a look at those, and you'll also see that there are fewer availability of range of motion and distance we can gain if we move more through those. So there's a real interesting place that we can explore in our hip. When we take this a step further, and over the years and years and years that I've been teaching anatomy and functional movement and yoga therapy to yoga teachers specifically, is that by and large, yoga teachers think they're a lot more mobile and a lot more open than they really are. They think they're open in their hips, and in fact what they're doing is, instead of doing a movement of a leg bone on the hips, say going into tree pose, what they're in fact doing is they're moving their pelvis like this, or they're shifting their pelvis like this. So if you look really closely here, my hip, my leg bone in my hip socket is not moving. What's doing the movement is my pelvis on the opposite femur and my pelvis up through to my spine and my torso. That's where the movement's happening. And that is a problem. Because if we're wanting to, if the aim of a movement is to do this, and meaning we're moving at the leg bone and the hip socket, and instead we're doing this, we're not cultivating this motion. And if we're not cultivating this motion, we're compensating up through here, which can, for many people, land in the SIs as they carry on through life, because there's just not a functional pattern, there's not a coordinated pattern, there's not smoothness, so the forces that are going through the body down and up don't have a smooth pathway. That bridge for the SIs is no longer a functional bridge because of what's not happening elsewhere in the body. Now, I've focused on simply these two areas, and we can relate this to really anywhere. Think about downward facing dog, for example. Downward facing dog is all about movement in the shoulder girdle and the pelvic girdle. Those are the two primary things that need to happen to go into dog. And in a lot of cases, people aren't moving in those two areas. They're moving in their backs, they're moving in their knees, they're moving in all sorts of places to compensate to try to get them into the pose. And we do this over and over and over again in our practice, and then we wonder why we're getting so darn tight and why we're in tension and why we're not progressing, and for a lot of people, why they end up with SI joint issues. So when we're looking at things like triangle, warrior 1, extended side angle, and warrior 2, what we want to really focus on is what's going on at the hips. So when we're going into warrior 1, whether you're stepping forward into the pose or whether you're stepping backward into the pose, are you moving the leg bone in the pelvis? Because to move backward or forward, all that needs to happen is the pelvis stays square, and then the leg bone moves only as the leg bone needs to, which as you step back, it's rotation and extension, right? And then if you're stepping forward, you're moving the front leg forward into flexion, and then you might step and rotate the back leg into external rotation. But the pelvis has stayed nice and quiet within. Typically what happens is the pelvis unsquares and then it re-squares. And that creates all this tension in through this area. And for someone who's got a weakness around their SI joints, they're just going to be blottoed with pain and strain, right? So they're trying to create a square pelvis, but they're doing so with a ton of tension. Whereas if they simply just move the leg bone the way it's meant to move, bada bing, bada boom, they're here in the position, and they're actually developing stability and greater mobility in through the pelvis overall, and specifically in through the hip joint. Same goes for triangle. Triangle, we're taking the legs wide, moving the leg bones into into rotation, external and internal rotation, and then triangle becomes a motion of hip. So pelvis moving on the leg bones. Whereas what typically happens in yoga is some people reach forward, they move the rib cage, before they move the pelvis. And this action, while it's meant to keep the sides long, actually puts a ton of strain down through the SI joints. Why is that? Well, when I move my front leg into external rotation and my back leg into internal, the muscles that are involved and how they're acting on the sacrum is different, right? Because I've got external happening on one, internal happening on the other. So there's something different happening, and it puts our sacrum and our SI joints in a slightly unstable position. This is not a bad thing. We're unstable in many parts of our life. But now, if we add this forward or this lateral motion of our rib cage relative to this piece, we're now putting a whole bunch of strain and a whole bunch of torque down and through the SIs. So if you have an inherent weakness there, you can be, again, blottoed with some strain. Your SI can go out, and just a whole host of yuckiness, which is a technical term, can happen. The focus then is to move the pelvis on the femurs and to improve this motion, not just to keep the sides long. You notice that when I move this way, my sides are inherently long, right? I'm keeping myself in Tadasana, and my sides are inherently long because where I'm moving from is here. So you might be asking, but I can't move through there. Well, it's like, well, yeah, I know you can't, which is probably why you have some issues in your SI, or if you don't have the tendency for SI, you might have it in your knee, or up in your T-spine, or up in your neck, right? If you're not moving through here, and that's actually what the pose is requiring of you, then you're going to compensate and you're going to have trouble somewhere in your body. It just depends on where that inherent weakness is. When we look at Warrior 2, same kind of thing. We've got one leg doing one thing, the other leg doing the other thing. But this time, we're now starting to lower from the hip. Now the tendency here is for people to move their knee more than their hip. Now if you look really closely when I move that way, see how the knee moves quicker than the hip. So the angle of the knee changes faster than the angle of the hip. And we actually want the hip angle and the knee angle to be moving at a relative pace. If that's not happening, then you're compensating. You're not improving the movement here, which again, if you have inherent weakness up and through your SI, then you might get blottoed in through the SI. Same goes for extended side angle. And you have to ask yourself then, is extended side angle appropriate if you are unable to really do Warrior 1 or if you're unable to do triangle? I'm not saying it is, I'm just asking you the question for yourself. If you're unable to do those movements, then what's happening when you do something like extended side angle, right? So it becomes very, very interesting to ponder the relationship of the SI joints to the various other movements of those poses. Now you might be wondering, I made a comment about tucking the tailbone, I made a comment about holding the ribs down and firm. So what's wrong with those? Well, oftentimes people are tucking the tailbone because they've gone too far into a movement and they don't actually have the movement and their butt starts to swing backwards, ducktailing. This is often seen when people take their legs wide, getting prepared for Warrior 2. They take them wide, and as they rotate the leg bones, what ends up happening is their pelvis goes backwards because they don't have the range of motion here, right? So then this happens, and then they go, oh, oops, better tuck the tailbone. But the reason why their pelvis went, oops, was because they were too far into a movement already and didn't have the available range. So their body had to compensate in order to get to where the ambition, the passion, wanted to go. So if you merely take your stance a little smaller, then make the rotation, making sure the rotation's happening from the hip sockets, you'll notice that your pelvis doesn't go out this way and then you won't actually have to tuck. See, the thing is that a lot of people believe or think that tucking the tailbone leads to more core stability. It's the furthest thing from the truth. There is not a single muscle in the action of tucking the tailbone that has anything remotely to do with core stability. So it's not a stabilizing factor. You might feel like you're getting some strengthening here, but what that actually is your superficial muscles of your rectus abdominis, which is nothing. It's nothing to do with your deep core stability. So let that notion of tucking the tailbone and core stability, let that one go, and you'll find that your practice really, really improves. Now what about the ribs? Well, the thing with the ribs is that when someone takes their arm up overhead, if they don't have the right range of motion or the proper range of motion in through their shoulder, oftentimes the ribs will move. Same thing can happen with the hips depending on the pose that one's doing. So then the person says, okay, or the teacher says, keep those ribs tucked in. Then you're holding really hard in through the upper abdominal muscles and the diaphragm as you're bringing the arm up. Now herein lies the problem. When you're holding firm and tight through here, you're overdeveloping your upper abdominal muscle fibers. And you're limiting the movement of your respiratory diaphragm. Your respiratory diaphragm and your pelvic diaphragm connect for full body breathing. Full body breathing, these two working together, pelvic diaphragm or pelvic floor and your respiratory diaphragm, have a direct impact on your core stability, which has a direct impact on your SI stability. So if you're holding this tight, then if you've got an inherent weakness in your SI joints, chances are pretty good that you're going to feel some strain down in your SI joints. So consider this for your practice. Consider the concept of ease. Consider the concept of relaxation. And step onto your mat knowing why you're doing your practice. What's leading you to your practice? Where is your ambition? Because so often The problem that we face is when our ambition overrides our patience. And we drive faster and further than our body can actually do in that moment. Which, one time, generally speaking, isn't bad, but over and over and over again, we start to pound away all the signals, all the whispers, all the intelligence that resides in our body for some ambition of doing a certain pose a certain way. If you can come into this place of understanding why you're getting onto your mat and where you are at, relatively speaking, ambition versus patience, and you then start to just understand that and recognize where you're moving toward, it will make a huge difference. And then if you can come from a place of ease and relaxation, move from that place and then strengthen that place, then what you're doing is you're strengthening on top of ease and relaxation. I understand that this is different than a typical fitness mentality. Fitness mentality is move, or rather strengthen to move, and then maybe you'll relax later. Whereas in yoga it's different. It's all about, hopefully anyway, it's all about relaxation, move from that place, develop a greater and greater ability to move with an ease, and then strengthen that ease. So what you build stamina and endurance around is ease, not of tension, not of compensation. I also want you to really consider pure movement, thinking about how your leg bones are moving in your pelvis. I can't tell you the number of times I've worked with teachers and even non-teachers, and when we get their leg bones moving the way they're meant to move in their hip sockets, it's extraordinary. I would say 99% of the time, when we can get that moving properly, their SI joint pain goes away. I would say 100, but I really can't because all of this in-studio research I do is in the studio. But it's so darn close to 100% of the time, it blows my mind. So I'll say 99% of the time, get these guys moving, the hip socket, hip joints moving much more functionally, SI stuff totally clears up. Combine that with an easier breath, combine that with softness through your ribcage, recognizing when you move your shoulders that you're only moving them to the degree and the ability that your ribs stay soft and easy. And that will become a video for a future time around the whole shoulder girdle. But in the meantime, think about the pure movement of your largest joints, easy breath, and then building that strength on top of those components. Have a great practice playing with that.